movement strategies, and he's going to be talking about agent-based modelling. So we're going to be moving on from graph approaches and that approach to agent-based modelling for large-scale evacuation.
And a bit more.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'd like you to think of the Fort McMurray incident, because some of the work that I'm going to discuss here started from that event. And during Fort McMurray, there were two events which I think were very telling, which was one, first of all, it was the largest insurance event in Canadian history, $10 billion, which tells you something. The two fatalities occurred during the evacuation. So the people weren't necessarily safe as they were evacuating. Secondly, the command and control centre, the command centre that was in charge of managing the event, was evacuated several times. So the very people in charge of managing the safety of the evacuation were evacuated. And also several hospital facilities and critical infrastructure facilities were evacuated. So bear that in mind as I'm going through this, because that event was the catalyst for some of the work I'm going to be talking about. So my name's S.Gwynne. This was developed by myself and Eva Hunt, formerly of this parish. What I'm going to be trying to do is touch on a number of projects that have been going on, a number of pieces of work from a range of different perspectives. So I'm currently, as I mentioned, I'm currently at Movement Strategies, but I'm also working with a number of universities, Lund, King's College here in London, Maryland and Waterloo in Canada. But formerly I was part of the Canadian government. So as I think it's at pointy end or whatever it is, I was at different points of that triangle, whether it's academia, industry or government, and they have different perspectives, that's for sure. So here's a rather nice graphic, I think, a schematic of the wildfire event. This was developed by Harry Mitchell at Imperial, and so here you have the fire event, the range of different climate events that are influencing that, the crown fires, the fire front, the remote, if you like, fire events such as firebrands and embers, and then, as I mentioned earlier, the smoke pouring over the buildings. But beyond that, we also have pedestrian and traffic events that are part of the evacuation. Several people have mentioned, as we've got over here, there is the potential of pedestrian evacuation and being part of that, but there's also the potential actually of pedestrians reaching their vehicles, which we may assume they may be local, but first of all they may not exist. They may be a public vehicle, or they may be damaged, or they may be a neighbour's house. So that actual part of the evacuation may be necessary to be reflected. But there are a number of similarities and differences in building fires. For instance, as is evident in this graphic, there's multiple modes of evacuation. There may be multiple hazard locations, and this is typically rare in a building event. There may be multiple evacuation events from, be it location or be it over time. You may have multiple points of safety, and they may have their own attributes, capacities, facilities. There may be a protracted period of notification and preparation. The scale of the event and the scale of the population involved, all of these are typically larger than in building evacuations. So scale, both along time and in terms of the event, is a different factor than might normally be the case in a building evacuation. Now, this all started for me a couple of years ago with the government, and I was quite surprised how little information had passed from the traditional, if you like, fire and fire safety community to the larger scale wildfire community. For instance, they didn't really have an understanding of the ASIC-RSIC concept that I was familiar with, the performance-based concept. And so we started to develop this idea of translating what's very familiar to us in fire safety and fire protection to that environment. And I think it's a nice way of characterising the additional complexity. So for instance, you'd have a fire event, and obviously a major difference in that fire event is firebrands and embers, that a building can catch fire remotely from the original event, just as a population can be affected remotely by smoke. But in terms of the evacuation process itself, there may be a protracted process of investigation, firefighting, reporting, communication, a whole level of activity and communication before an evacuation notice is provided. So this increases the complexity of the response. You may have populations who respond before the instruction, and populations who respond in a complex way after that instruction is provided. So I think there is information that we can share between the communities, both at smaller scale and larger scale, but we have to be aware of the implications of that information. So part of what happened during my time in Canada was that there was a recognition that post Fort McMurray there was regulatory developments required to manage the wildfire threat. Now there was some international regulation, some in the EU, some with the ICC, and a range of different NFPA regulations that try and manage aspects of wildfire community development. And indeed there are guidance documents such as Firewise and FireSmart in North America. Indeed Firewise is now being used in some regions in the UK for the first time, I believe, recently. So, but there was no equivalent Canadian code. There was no equivalent regulatory structure that governed how you might develop communities in the WUI interface. So this was the structure that the Canadian government came up with to prioritise the work that needed to be done in order for them to start to develop a regulatory structure. And I'm going to just touch on a few of these today that involves modelling and more fundamental work. So firstly, what were they trying to develop? They were trying to develop a national code for WUI fires, given the lack of Canadian provisions. And this has been ongoing for several years now. There's 25 plus stakeholders, international stakeholders. And just looking at this blue diagram here, to me it was very evident as someone who's been involved in evacuation, was that there was quite a lot of understanding of hazard and exposure factors. Think of the fire and how it developed. There was quite a lot of understanding of the construction factors. What are the properties of the community and how vulnerable are the physical structures. There was very little representation of how people might respond, how you might inform that community on what to do in an event, and what planning you might put in place. So that's not to say we didn't understand what we should do, it just wasn't reflected in the guidance or the regulatory documents. So that was, if you like, that was the government project that we were starting. In conjunction with that, it started to spark off research projects such as this one here with some of my Swedish and Italian colleagues who looked at, I think this is the Polytechnic in Bari, and they looked at a large-scale review of regulatory structures internationally to how they attempted to manage and mitigate wildfires. It was quite a dry process, to be honest, but it's one of those where all of the regulations were gathered in one place for someone else to look at, and obviously this was important as part of our ongoing work. The second element of it was, well, how do we collect data post-event, post-incident, such that we can maintain our understanding? This sparked a project that was funded by the Canadian government with WPI in the US, and we interviewed several data collectors, so those government officials that go out into the field in the US and capture data from wildfire, hurricane and flood events. How do they do that? What's the type of information they collect? And then we reviewed a range of different, I think it was 16 reports documenting wildfire events, and then tried to come up with a procedure that is representative of those data collection efforts and a template for doing this in the future. So this is publicly available. One of the interesting things here, and this reflects on the sort of siloed nature of our work, we did a lot of work with NIST in America, and we basically connected some of the researchers who responded to wildfires and hurricanes and floods, whereas they wouldn't necessarily have spoken to each other. And so we actually made them speak to each other in a rather useful way. As I say, this is available. And because of that, and as part of the government process, it sparked, and as it's been discussed here, an idea that actually we need to gather together some of the documentation that describes how residents respond to WUI interface fires, or WUI fires rather, and then how those factors might influence that response and be modelled. And so this work on the left here, this was with York University in Canada, and this work on the right was with Massey in New Zealand. So on the left it's what factors should we care about, and on the right it's how might we model those factors. And Ruggiero Lovreglio in Massey, he basically did some advanced regression analysis on this, applied it to his own data that was collected in Massey, and saw in New Zealand rather, and saw how influential these individual factors might be. So this is, if you like, some of the research that was coming from that government request in Canada. So one of the things I think that's changed over the last 10 years is that now we're all geographers, right? We all have to map things, and everything, if it's not visualizable on a geographical system, people now, it's almost like something remiss. It's a key way of communicating risk and vulnerability. One of the goals of this regulatory development in Canada was to develop a map of Canada that showed the relative vulnerability of different communities. And that was going to be a composite of data collected at that point in time, historical data, and then projections. Now obviously, a lot of the discussion here today has been about projections, about our ability to project this into the future. So we did a review of risk systems and web-based risk systems, and they typically captured some elements of our requirements very well. So it might be where events have occurred, where fires have occurred, where they are now, and projections of where they might be in the future. What they didn't capture particularly well was the interaction between fire events and the communities that are subject to those events. And so the concept here being the same fire can pose a different threat to different communities. And that wasn't very well captured in the systems that were available at that time. So two things sparked out of that, I think. Firstly, we did some work on developing vulnerability measures. That is the capacity of communities to cope with wildfire events. Not just where the fire was, and how it spread, but what were the resources available to different communities that might enable them to get to a place of safety. And that's both, for instance, access to vehicles, but it may also be the road system in place. Now, obviously, the point there being, if you were able to develop a vulnerability measure and map it, it would enable people to then say, well, how do we prioritise different communities? How do we rank them? Now, what we didn't do at this point was look at what are the modelling tools available to populate this, or what analytical tools were available. That's coming down the pipeline. But as a concept, typically, the mapping systems that were available were risk-based as opposed to vulnerability-based. And they're conceptually slightly different things, certainly from my understanding. What's going on now has been in parallel to this is some work going on in Sweden, and I think it's been mentioned several times today, Sweden, as a sort of an up-and-coming challenge in this area. Looking at how do we represent the risk posed by multiple hazards. So not just wildfire events, but flooding and snow-based events. And this looks at two different elements of it, or elements of that risk, which is crowding. So could an area be subject to multiple events? And cascading, does your event lead to other secondary outcomes? So for instance, does your flooding lead to power loss? Does your wildfire lead to food shortages? Or so on, or health events? Now what's evolving in this process that we're doing with Lund and Canadian government and the Swedish Meteorological Society is that actually it eventually will become some sort of vulnerability analysis anyway, because if you apply it to different parts of Sweden, you will get different outcomes. You will get different, they're very different communities. And what's interesting at the moment is Sweden applies and uses the current Canadian Fire Weather Index. And as has been mentioned several times, how relevant that is to the specifics of the Sweden is debatable. And so part of this work is evolving that index to be more reflective of Swedish conditions. So the Canadian experience led us, myself, some researchers at Imperial and Lund, to try and come up with a very simple platform for simulating wildfire events. And the purpose here, the first phase was a macro level platform. And it was to sort of crudely represent the impact of fire using the FARSIGHT model, a flow-based pedestrian model, and then an empirical traffic model to reflect evolving conditions over time. The point being, this was freely available. So this is not out yet. It'll be freely available for people to use and break. One of the things that came out of this was the work from Harry Mitchell, which I think is quite an interesting concept, which is to identify trigger buffers. So from our experience historically, if you go and visit a community, they'll say, when do you start evacuating? It will be when the fire reaches the church on the hill, or when it hits the river, or some relatively arbitrary indicator, but everyone can see it. Well, that's not particularly performance-based. That doesn't tell you how much time you've got at that point. And so what Harry did was to try and come up with a more rigorous approach to that based on an A-set, R-set analysis. And he's using some of the inputs from the model, but it's sort of model agnostic. You can drop in whichever model that you've got available. The point being that actually, assuming that the models capture some of the key elements of performance, then that does actually give you a vulnerability assessment. It does tell you how vulnerable your community is, because it tells you, given that you're representing the types of behaviours we expect and the factors that influence the outcome, how many people are still left evacuating at certain points in time. So you just sort of integrate under this curve. And so instead of having to represent them in some sort of functional form, you model them, and then the output itself tells you the vulnerability. How many people are you still worried about at any point in time, and where are they? So more recently, that project allowed me to go out to the US in Colorado to evacuate a small community there who's very vulnerable to wildfire. I think this Roxborough Park was close to Evergreen, which was the second most vulnerable place in America after Paradise. I think that's true. So it was near to 2 previous wildfires. And what we did was we went out there, we worked with the local community. They do drills on wildfire response. So they enrolled in this process, and we worked with the local fire service and emergency managers there. So it's a community of about 900 homes. And it's a large, it's spread along a valley, and either side of it is forested area, so it's very vulnerable. I think 900 homes are involved in that community, about 130 registered, and on the day we collected 60 odd surveys, and we made 100 plus observations of when they arrived at a certain point. So it was a gated community. So when they arrived at those gates, and then when they arrived at the assembly point. And we split this according to the routes that they used and the areas that they came from. And we collected data on the pre-evacuation time, so when the residents either were observed to initiate movement or reported movement, and we did a separate analysis there, and that analysis was based on zone. Then we looked at what routes they used, and then when they arrived. And these 2 curves on the right here show when they reported arriving and when they were observed arriving. So we know it's in that range. Now, this has not been published yet, but we're going to publish this in the future. This will appear in the Wilmington report, but we'll do an article on this as well, produce an article. So what we did was, even with our simple model here, and our model works at like a 30 metre by 30 metre grid, so it's very high level. We configured the model to say, well, how well could we reflect the conditions of that community drill, and then how could we scale it up? Remember that only 15% of the community took part. And they got that data and they collected it, and that's actually very useful for them, but it doesn't necessarily tell them how long it would take to evacuate their community, or indeed what might the implications of route loss and other elements might be. So we included some of that data inside the model, and then we reproduced a couple of simulations. Here you can see Harry Mitchell's model applied to that area. So here's the fire spread, and then here's eventually the trigger points that he identified. So here we have the if you wanted to have some sort of buffer of 25%, you need to start evacuating when the fire gets to this point, and at this point it's 1 to 1, so you've just got enough time. Now, obviously, the accuracy of those zones are reliant on the accuracy of the underlying models. But actually, you know, that's going to be also reliant on our understanding of how factors influence performance, and then of course the data available. So we looked at some of this. We embedded the data into the model to set up some scenarios, and we looked at sort of 4 scenarios. I'll just touch on 2 of them today. So firstly, we wanted to see, could we accurately reflect the conditions that we saw, and then could we accurately reflect if the full community, if we could project the full community evacuation. And something really interesting happened that sort of shocked us, but then actually makes the point about vulnerability. So if you see here, this was our estimate of scenario 2, which was, you know, basically, can we reproduce the drill assuming there's no fire? And broadly, we get in the same ballpark of their arrival times. It's a couple of hours, so and there were some outliers, which is similar. And then when we did it for the whole community, scaling up the numbers, actually the overall time is similar, but the number of people who were still in the community was much higher. So the road system wasn't necessarily limiting the evacuation that much. It was just the volume of them still getting out of the system. So more of them are responding later, basically. So this both surprised them and concerned them, because it means that there's some potential here to enhance the performance, but also it's not just the end point. It's the process that gets them there. As I said, this is a relatively simple model. It certainly doesn't address some of the complexities that we're talking about, but the whole purpose here is it was developed in a Unity system such that the platform is ready to have more sophisticated models dropped in, and that's the next phase of our analysis. So for instance, an agent-based pedestrian response model, a more complex fire representation, and so on. I think one of the big challenges, though, that we face is how to represent the movement of the fire from the vegetation to the buildings. Because you typically model the fire in the vegetation at one level, and the movement from the vegetation to the buildings occurs at a much more refined and local level. And that's usually the way to give a fire model as a panic attack, is talk about those interfaces. So just to conclude, I've tried to give a very high level, very quick overview of some of the projects that have been fired off in the last 3 or 4 years. Wildfires present a complex and worsening situation, and they're worsening not just because of environmental conditions. They're worsening because of social and economic conditions and choices made by people to live in certain communities. Although differences do exist with building fires, there is many lessons to be learned, both from that we can learn from the wildfire experts, and that they can learn from the more pragmatic tools, performance-based tools that we're used to using now in the built environment. Obviously, as has been mentioned, we need new ways of enhancing data collection, and this may well be part of the research activities that we've spoken about, but also using newer technologies, just mapping people's movement around large spaces. New modelling tools are becoming available, many of which have been discussed earlier today. Also, communicating our results to different audiences. The ability to map and identify and quantify vulnerability of different communities is key. Because there's one thing talking about the technicalities of modelling and the technicalities of the underlying research, but you have to be able to communicate the implications of that. What does it mean to a community if you spend X £100,000 on your local provisions? You need to be able to quantify that in a very clear way. As mentioned, regulation and guidance is being developed. We've just recently, in Canada, we're just still finalising this guidance. It's going to go to public review. Then that will go into regulation some way down the line. But we're that far, we're at that stage of development. By definition, this is a collaborative effort. I don't think it's very hard as an individual researcher, consultant, or government member to do any of this on your own. So almost by definition, it has to be collaborative. And in that spirit, anything that people see here that's of interest, I'm more than willing to share. Final thing is this has just been recognised as a requirement in the SFPE handbook. So there's going to be a chapter on wildfire evacuation at some point, and so that's coming down the pipeline. So that's an interesting development because it means that wildfire evacuation is now entered into the fire protection engineers' remit in North America. So that's something to watch out for. Anyway, thanks very much.
Thanks, Steve. We're going to move on to our last presentation for the morning. Before I do, just a bit